The last message Ozzy Osbourne wrote to Vince Neil made him burst into tears as he said goodbye. The text message arrived at 2:17 a.m. Pacific Time on July 18, 2025, just 4 days before Ozzy Osbourne would pass away in his Buckinghamshire home. Vince Neil was lying awake in his bed at the rehabilitation center in Texas, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with the demons that had brought him to this point. When his phone buzzed with an incoming message, he almost ignored it. Another well-meaning friend or family member checking in on his progress, he assumed. But when he saw the sender's name, his heart stopped. Ozzy Osbourne. The message that followed would become the most precious thing Vince Neil would ever receive. A final gift from a man who had been both mentor and friend for over 40 years. More than that, it would be the catalyst for the most profound transformation of Neil's life. A turning point that came at the darkest hour, delivered by someone who understood both the heights of rock stardom and the depths of addiction better than almost anyone else on earth. Vince, the message began, typed painstakingly with trembling hands, affected by Parkinson's disease. I'm writing this at 3 a.m. England time because I can't sleep thinking about you. Sharon told me you finally went to that place in Texas. I'm so fucking proud of you, mate. I know how hard it is to admit you need help. It took me too many tries to get it right. If this emotional revelation about Ozzy's final message to Vince Neil is touching your heart, please consider leaving a like to support more coverage of these deeply personal stories. Your engagement helps us honor these important moments between rock legends. The relationship between Ozzy Osbourne and Vince Neil had been forged in the fires of rock and roll excess during the infamous 1984 tour, when Motley Crue opened for Ozzy on his Bark at the Moon tour. What should have been a straightforward professional arrangement had quickly evolved into something much deeper. A brotherhood built on shared experiences of addiction, fame, and the unique pressures that came with being frontmen for two of metal's most notorious bands. That 1984 tour had been legendary for all the wrong reasons. The combination of Ozzy's already established reputation for chaos and Motley Crue's youthful appetite for destruction had created a perfect storm of debauchery that became the stuff of rock folklore. But beneath all the headlines about hotel room destruction and backstage excess, a genuine friendship had developed between the two singers. What people never understood about that tour, Neil would later reflect, was that Ozzy took us under his wing. Yeah, we were all completely out of our minds most of the time, but Ozzy was also teaching us how to survive in this business. He showed us that you could be wild on stage and still be professional about the music. The message continued. I've been thinking about that night in Detroit, 1984. You remember, when you found me in that hotel bathroom, completely gone, and you didn't call security or management. You just sat with me until I came down. You were just a kid then, barely 23, but you understood something that most people twice your age never figure out. You understood that addiction doesn't make someone a bad person, just a sick person who needs help. The memory that Ozzy referenced was one that both men had carried for decades, though they had rarely spoken about it directly. During the Detroit show on that infamous tour, Ozzy had disappeared after his performance, eventually found by Neil in a hotel bathroom, unconscious and blue around the lips from what would later be determined as a near-fatal combination of alcohol and pills. While the rest of both bands' crews were focused on the after-party and the chaos that always followed their shows, the 23-year-old Vince Neil had made a decision that probably saved Ozzy's life. Instead of calling for help immediately, which would have brought management, potentially media attention, and definitely consequences for everyone involved, Neil had stayed with Ozzy, talking to him, keeping him conscious, and eventually helping him recover enough to get medical attention quietly. You never asked for anything in return, Ozzy's message continued. You never used it against me. Never told the story to make yourself look good. You just helped because that's who you are. That night taught me something about real friendship, about the kind of loyalty that exists between people who understand each other's struggles. The text message had reached Neil at a moment when he desperately needed to hear those words. His admission to the Texas rehabilitation facility had been the result of what those closest to him described as a controlled collapse. Years of increasing alcohol abuse that had finally reached a point where intervention was necessary to save his life. The decision to enter treatment hadn't been easy for Neil. At 64, he had maintained his image as rock's eternal bad boy, someone who could handle anything and keep performing no matter what. Admitting that he needed help felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that the lifestyle that had defined him for 4 decades was finally winning the battle. But it had been Ozzy himself who had convinced Neil to seek treatment. Just 6 weeks before his death, Ozzy had orchestrated what amounted to a private intervention, reaching out to Neil during one of his darkest periods and offering both support and a path forward. "Remember what I told you when I called you last month?" Ozzy's message continued. "I said that getting sober wasn't about admitting you're weak. It's about admitting you're strong enough to change. I've been sober for long stretches over the years, and I've relapsed more times than I care to count. But every time I got back up, I got a little bit stronger. Every time I tried again, I learned something new about myself." The phone call that Ozzy referenced had been one of the most difficult conversations of Neil's life. Ozzy, despite his own declining health and the obvious effort that speaking required due to his Parkinson's disease, had spent over 2 hours on the phone with Neil, sharing stories about his own struggles with addiction and recovery. "The thing that struck me most about that conversation," Neil later recalled, "was how honest Ozzy was about his failures. He didn't try to pretend that sobriety was easy or that he had figured everything out. He just told me that the alternative, continuing to drink and use, was worse than the hard work of getting clean." During that call, Ozzy had shared details about his own treatment experiences that he had never discussed publicly. He talked about the shame and embarrassment of admitting he needed help, about the difficulty of facing his family and fans while acknowledging his problems, and about the daily work required to maintain sobriety in an industry that practically celebrated excess. "But here's what I learned," Ozzy had told Neil during that conversation, "and what I want you to understand. Getting sober doesn't mean you stop being yourself. It means you get to become the best version of yourself. All the creativity, all the passion, all the things that make you a great performer, they don't go away. They just get clearer." The text message continued with observations about Neil's career and legacy that showed how closely Ozzy had been following his friend's journey. "I've watched you perform for 40 years, Vince. I've seen you at your absolute best, and I've seen you struggling. But I want you to know that even on your worst days, even when you thought you were fooling everyone, your talent still shone through. Your voice, your stage presence, your ability to connect with an audience, none of that was ever about the drugs or the alcohol. That was all you." This acknowledgement meant everything to Neil, who had spent years wondering if his abilities as a performer were somehow dependent on his lifestyle of excess. The fear that sobriety might somehow diminish his artistic abilities had been one of the biggest obstacles to seeking treatment. "There's something else I need to tell you," Ozzy's message continued. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Sharon. Do you remember the first night of that '84 tour in Portland? You were so nervous about opening for me that you were throwing up before the show. I watched from the side of the stage that night, and I thought to myself, this kid has something special. This kid might be better at this than I am." The revelation was shocking to Neil, who had always assumed that Ozzy barely noticed the opening acts on his tours. To learn that not only had Ozzy been paying attention, but that he had seen something special in the young Mötley Crüe singer provided a validation that Neil hadn't realized he needed. "I know the industry has changed since we started," Ozzy continued. "I know it's harder now to be authentic, harder to connect with people the way we used to. But your voice, your style, your approach to rock and roll, that's timeless. That doesn't get old or go out of fashion. The world still needs what you have to offer." The message then shifted to more personal territory, revealing the depth of Ozzy's concern for his friend's well-being. "I know you're scared right now. I know treatment feels like giving up, like admitting defeat, but I want you to think of it differently. Think of it as preparation for the next chapter. Think of it as getting ready for whatever comes after this." Ozzy went on to share specific strategies that had helped him during his own treatment experiences, practical advice about dealing with cravings, managing anxiety, and finding new sources of meaning and purpose beyond the immediate gratification of drugs and alcohol. "The hardest part for me was always the boredom," Ozzy wrote. "When you're used to living at maximum intensity all the time, normal life can feel incredibly dull. But that's where you learn to appreciate things you never noticed before. Conversations with people you care about, music that you're actually present to hear, sunsets that you're sober enough to really see." The message also contained Ozzy's reflections on their shared history and the bond that had connected them across 4 decades of parallel careers. We've seen a lot of people come and go in this business, Vince. We've outlasted trends and critics, and record executives who thought we were finished. We've survived because we understand something that a lot of people don't. This isn't just a job for us. This is who we are. But being a rock star doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself in the process. As Neil continued reading, tears began streaming down his face. The combination of Ozzy's evident concern, his practical wisdom, and his unwavering belief in Neil's potential was overwhelming. For months, Neil had felt isolated and hopeless, convinced that his best days were behind him and that his problems were too deep and too complicated for anyone else to understand. "I want to tell you about the last few months of my life," Ozzy continued. "Since we knew my time was limited, I've been thinking a lot about legacy, about what really matters. And you know what I realized? The music is important. The performances are important. But what matters most are the relationships we build along the way. The people we help, the connections we make, the love we share." This section of the message revealed just how much thought Ozzy had been putting into his final communications with the people who mattered most to him. Rather than focusing on his own approaching mortality, he was using his remaining time and energy to try to help others. "I've been reaching out to people I care about, trying to say the things I should have said years ago. But with you, I wanted to do more than just say goodbye. I wanted to leave you with something that might help you get through this next phase of your life. I wanted to remind you of who you really are, underneath all the noise and chaos." The message then contained what would become the most quoted and remembered portion: Ozzy's direct appeal to Neil to continue fighting for his sobriety and his life. "Promise me something, Vince. Promise me you'll stick with the program, even when it gets hard. Promise me you'll remember that getting sober isn't about giving up who you are. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be. Promise me you'll use whatever time you have left to create something beautiful." As Neil read these words, he found himself making that promise out loud, speaking to the empty room as if Ozzy could hear him. The commitment he made in that moment would become the foundation for everything that followed in his recovery journey. "There's one more thing," Ozzy's message concluded. "When I'm gone, when you hear people talking about the wild stories and the crazy times, I want you to remember the other side of it. Remember the quiet conversations, the times we helped each other through dark periods, the friendship that survived everything this business threw at us. That's the real legacy. That's what actually matters." The final paragraph of the message contained words that Neil would later have tattooed on his arm. "You saved my life once in a Detroit hotel bathroom when we were both just kids trying to figure out how to be rock stars. Now I'm trying to return the favor. Get well, my friend. The world still needs Vince Neil, but it needs the sober, healthy version. I love you, brother. Until we meet again. Ozzy." Neil sat in his rehabilitation center bed, holding his phone and crying harder than he had in years. The message represented everything he had been hoping to hear, but hadn't known how to ask for. Validation of his worth as an artist, acknowledgement of his struggles without judgment, practical advice from someone who had traveled the same difficult path, and most importantly, unconditional love and support from someone he deeply respected. But the impact of Ozzy's message extended far beyond that initial emotional response. Over the following days and weeks, Neil found himself returning to the text repeatedly, finding new layers of meaning and drawing strength from different passages, depending on what challenges he was facing in his recovery process. When he struggled with the daily routine of treatment, he remembered Ozzy's words about preparation for the next chapter. When he felt tempted to leave the facility early, he thought about his promise to stick with the program. When he worried that sobriety might diminish his abilities as a performer, he focused on Ozzy's assurance that his talent had never been dependent on substances. The news of Ozzy's death, which reached Neil just 4 days after receiving the message, was devastating, but also somehow strengthening. Rather than viewing it as a loss of his support system, Neil chose to see it as a sacred responsibility. Ozzy had used some of his final energy to try to help him. The least he could do was honor that gift by continuing to work toward recovery. "When I heard that Ozzy had died," Neil later explained, "my first thought wasn't about losing a friend, though that pain was real. My first thought was that he had spent some of his last moments on Earth thinking about me and trying to help me. How could I possibly waste that? How could I not do everything in my power to make his final message to me meaningful?" The message became a turning point not just in Neil's treatment, but in his entire approach to recovery and to life. For the first time in years, he began to see sobriety not as a limitation or a punishment, but as an opportunity to discover aspects of himself that had been buried under decades of substance abuse. The rehabilitation process that followed was still difficult. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the cravings felt overwhelming. But whenever Neil felt like giving up, he would read Ozzy's message again, drawing strength from his friends' belief in him and remembering his promise to stick with the program. The impact extended beyond Neil's personal recovery to his relationships with family, friends, and bandmates. Armed with Ozzy's message and the clarity that came with sobriety, Neil began reaching out to people he had hurt or neglected during his years of active addiction. He had difficult but necessary conversations with his Mötley Crüe bandmates, his children, and his ex-wives, working to repair relationships that had been damaged by his behavior. Ozzy's message didn't just help me get sober, Neil reflected months later. It helped me understand what sobriety was for. It wasn't just about stopping drinking and drugging. It was about becoming the person I was capable of being, the person my friends and family deserved to have in their lives. The message also influenced Neil's approach to his musical career. Rather than seeing his addiction struggles as something to hide or be ashamed of, he began incorporating his recovery journey into his music, writing songs about the experience of getting sober and the process of rebuilding his life. Ozzy showed me that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness, Neil explained. He was never afraid to admit his struggles, and that honesty connected with people in a way that all the posturing and pretending never could. The final impact of Ozzy's message came in Neil's decision to become an advocate for addiction recovery within the music industry. Using his platform and his story, he began speaking openly about his struggles and encouraging other musicians to seek help when they needed it. If Ozzy could use his final days to try to help me, then I can use whatever time I have left to try to help others, Neil said during one of his first public speaking engagements about addiction. Maybe someone else will read about my story, or hear Ozzy's words and realize that they don't have to suffer alone. The message that Ozzy Osbourne wrote to Vince Neil in his final days became more than just a goodbye between friends. It became a testament to the power of authentic connection, unconditional support, and the belief that it's never too late to change course and find redemption. For Neil, those words represented the difference between despair and hope, between isolation and connection, between giving up and fighting for another chance at life. They were the final gift from a friend who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply to believe in their capacity for transformation. Years later, when people asked Neil about the moment that changed his life, he would always return to that text message received in a Texas rehabilitation center at 2:17 a.m. He would describe the tears that came as he read Ozzy's words, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. The recognition that he was loved, that he was valued, and that his story didn't have to end in tragedy. Ozzy's message saved my life, Neil would always conclude. But more than that, it showed me that my life was worth saving. Sometimes that's all any of us really need. Someone who sees our potential even when we can't see it ourselves. Someone who believes in our ability to change even when we've given up believing in ourselves. The ripple effects of Ozzy's final message extended far beyond Vince Neil's personal recovery journey. As Neil became more open about sharing his story, the message began to inspire other musicians and fans who were struggling with similar battles. The rehabilitation center in Texas where Neil had received the message reported a significant increase in admission inquiries, with many potential patients specifically mentioning Neil's story as their motivation for seeking help. What Ozzy did with that message, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, Neil's addiction counselor at the facility, was demonstrate the power of peer support in recovery. Sometimes the most effective intervention comes not from medical professionals, but from someone who has walked the same path and survived to tell about it. The message also had a profound impact on the broader rock community's approach to addiction and mental health. Several other aging rockers came forward with their own stories of how Ozzy had reached out to them during difficult periods, revealing a pattern of quiet mentorship and support that had largely remained hidden from public view. Tommy Lee, Neil's Mötley Crüe bandmate, revealed that Ozzy had also contacted him during Neil's rehabilitation, asking how he could best support their friend's recovery. Ozzy understood something that a lot of people don't. Lee explained. He knew that addiction affects entire families and friend groups, not just the person who's struggling. He wanted to make sure all of us knew how to help Vince succeed. The message's influence on Neil's artistic output became evident when he returned to music following his successful completion of treatment. His first post-rehab performance at a small venue in Nashville 6 months after Ozzy's death included a new song called 2:17 a.m., a direct tribute to the moment when he received Ozzy's life-changing text. "I woke up to salvation in a message on my phone," Neil sang, his voice stronger and clearer than it had been in years. "From a friend who knew the darkness, who had walked this path alone. He reached across the distance, from his pain into mine, said it's never too late to leave the past behind." The song became an anthem for recovery communities around the world, with many treatment centers requesting permission to use the lyrics in their programs. Neil gladly granted these requests, seeing them as a way to extend Ozzy's message of hope to even more people who needed to hear it. The documentary that was eventually made about Neil's recovery journey featured extensive segments about Ozzy's final message and its impact. The filmmakers were granted unprecedented access to the actual text message, with Neil agreeing to share Ozzy's words publicly for the first time as part of the documentary. "I kept that message private for a long time because it felt too sacred to share," Neil explained during the documentary interview. "But then I realized that Ozzy wouldn't want me to keep his wisdom to myself. He'd want it to help as many people as possible." The documentary, titled Messages of Hope, won several awards and sparked conversations about addiction recovery that reached far beyond the music industry. It was screened at medical conferences, addiction treatment facilities, and community centers, with Neil often appearing for Q&A sessions afterward. During these appearances, Neil would always emphasize that while Ozzy's message had been crucial to his recovery, it had only been effective because he had been ready to receive it. "You can't save someone who isn't ready to be saved," he would explain. "But when someone is ready, sometimes all they need is to know that someone believes in them." The impact on Neil's family relationships was perhaps the most personally meaningful result of his recovery and Ozzy's message. His relationship with his children, which had been strained for years due to his addiction, began to heal as he demonstrated his commitment to sobriety through consistent actions rather than just promises. "Dad had made promises to get clean before," his daughter Elizabeth later shared in an interview. "But this time was different. This time he talked about Ozzy's message and what it meant to him. He seemed to understand that getting sober wasn't just about him, it was about honoring the trust that Ozzy had placed in him." The message also influenced Neil's approach to his relationships with his Motley Crue bandmates. The band, which had been fractured by years of addiction-related conflicts and personal tensions, began the slow process of healing their relationships. While they didn't immediately reunion for touring or recording, they started spending time together socially for the first time in years. "Ozzy's message reminded me that the relationships that matter most are the ones built on shared experiences and mutual support," Neil reflected. "Tommy, Nikki, and Mick. We've been through everything together. We've made mistakes, we've hurt each other, but at the end of the day, we're family. Ozzy's message helped me remember what that really means." The charitable work that Neil began during his recovery was also directly inspired by Ozzy's final words. He established the 217 Foundation, named after the time he received Ozzy's message, which provides support for musicians struggling with addiction. The foundation offers everything from treatment scholarships to peer mentorship programs. "Ozzy used his final days to reach out and help people," Neil explained during the foundation's launch event. "The least I can do is use the days I've been given to do the same thing. If we can help even one person avoid the years of pain and destruction that addiction causes, then Ozzy's message will have accomplished something important." The Foundation's peer mentorship program became particularly successful, pairing established musicians in recovery with those currently seeking help. The model was directly based on the relationship that Ozzy had demonstrated in his final message to Neil, one of unconditional support, practical wisdom, and unwavering belief in the possibility of change. Neil's sobriety also allowed him to participate more fully in tributes and memorials for Ozzy following his death. At a major tribute concert held at the Hollywood Bowl, Neil performed a stunning version of "Mama, I'm Coming Home" that he dedicated to Ozzy's memory and to everyone who was fighting their own battles with addiction. "This song is for Ozzy, who saved my life with his final words, Neil told the audience before beginning the performance. But it's also for anyone out there who's struggling and wondering if tomorrow can be different from today. Ozzy wanted me to tell you that it can be. It absolutely can be. The performance was widely regarded as one of Neil's finest vocal performances in years, a testament to how sobriety had restored not just his health, but his artistic abilities. Critics noted the emotional depth and technical precision of his singing, qualities that had been diminished during his years of active addiction. The music industry's response to Neil's recovery and his openness about Ozzy's role in it helped shift conversations about addiction within the entertainment community. Rather than treating substance abuse as a moral failing or career-ending scandal, more artists began speaking openly about their struggles and seeking help when they needed it. Vince's story, and particularly Ozzy's message to him, showed us that addiction doesn't have to be the end of the story, observed music industry veteran Danny Goldberg. It can be the beginning of a new chapter, one that's potentially even more meaningful than what came before. The technological aspect of Ozzy's message, delivered via text rather than a letter or phone call, also spoke to how the modern music industry maintained relationships and provided support. The immediacy and intimacy of text communication allowed for a different kind of connection than traditional forms of correspondence. There's something about receiving a text message that makes it feel immediate and personal, Neil observed. When I saw Ozzy's name on my phone, even though he was thousands of miles away, it felt like he was right there with me in that moment. That immediacy made his words even more powerful. The preservation of the message in digital format also ensured that Neil would never lose those precious words. He had the text printed and framed, but knowing that the original would always be available on his phone provided an additional layer of security and comfort. As Neil continued his recovery journey, he began to understand that Ozzy's message had been about more than just getting sober. It had been about reclaiming his identity, rebuilding his relationships, and finding new sources of meaning and purpose in his life. Sobriety wasn't the end goal, Neil came to realize. It was just the beginning. Ozzy's message helped me understand that getting clean was about creating the space for me to become the person I was always meant to be. The legacy of Ozzy's final message to Vince Neil continued to grow and influence people years after both the message was sent and Ozzy's death. Treatment centers began using the story as part of their curriculum, demonstrating how peer support and genuine care could be catalysts for transformation. Recovery coaches started referring to Ozzy moments, those crucial instances when someone receives exactly the support they need at exactly the right time. The concept became part of the lexicon of addiction recovery, representing the power of human connection to interrupt destructive patterns and inspire positive change. The story also became a powerful example of how legacy could be created through personal relationships rather than just professional achievements. While Ozzy would be remembered primarily for his music and his influence on heavy metal, his final message to Vince Neil demonstrated that his greatest impact might have been on the individual lives he touched through acts of kindness and support. When people talk about Ozzy's legacy, Neil would often say in interviews, they focus on Black Sabbath, on his solo career, on his influence on music. But for me, his greatest achievement was being the kind of friend who would use his final days to try to save someone else's life. That's the Ozzy I want people to remember. The last message that Ozzy Osbourne wrote to Vince Neil had indeed made him burst into tears as he said goodbye. Not just goodbye to Ozzy, but goodbye to the version of himself that had been slowly dying for years, making room for the person he was meant to become. In those tears was grief for time lost, gratitude for friendship offered, and hope for the possibility of redemption and renewal. The message became proof that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone, that someone somewhere believes in our capacity for change, and that it is never too late to choose a different path. In sharing those words with the world, Vince Neil ensured that Ozzy's final gift would continue to offer hope and healing to countless others who needed to hear that they too were worth saving. If this story of friendship, recovery, and second chances has moved you as much as it moved Vince Neil, please share it and leave a like. Sometimes the most powerful messages are the ones that arrive at our darkest moments, reminding us that we are loved, that we have value, and that transformation is always possible when we have the courage to accept help. and the determination to change.